Hey Wapters, Mr. Lassiter with you, and in this video I'm going to go over the last couple sections of chapter 26. Again, apologies for not being there, but you have plenty of work to do today, so I'm going to try to get through it quickly. And we're going to start with the great powers of Europe, and mainly with Germany. Uh, and kind of the big ideas I think will probably be in kind of bold, and then we'll have the rest. But just keep in mind that international relations in Europe centered around the this unification that we see in Germany. This led to the isolation of France and a loose coalition with Austria-Hungary, which is this new empire that comes about, and Russia, of course. At home, Otto von Bismarck, who you see pictured, used his politics and social legislation to gain popular support and also to develop that sense of nationalism that we talked about in class yesterday. Um, Wilhelm II eventually dismisses Bismarck and initiates a new German foreign policy that really places an emphasis on colonization. And we see that in the carving up of Africa and things of that nature. The two great liberal powers in Europe were France and Great Britain. But France now became basically a second-rate power in Europe. Its population and army were smaller than those of Germany. Its rate of industrial growth was lower than that of Germany. So it seemed that French society was divided between kind of these old monarchists who were usually Catholics and religious, and then Republicans, kind of liberals with anti-clerical views. But in fact, we actually see that because they had a lot of people participating in politics, there was a strong sense of nationalism, and the system of education in France gave people kind of a very close cohesion and a French identity. In Britain, there was a much more stable government, and there was kind of a narrowing in the disparity of wealth. So the lower classes were rising up and gaining more wealth. However, there were a number of problems in Britain, including the issue with Ireland and Irish resentment of English rule that would occasionally flare up, an economy that lagged behind the United States in Europe, and a huge empire which was very expensive to defend. Uh, for most of the 19th century, Britain pursued a policy of what's called splendid isolation toward Europe. They were really preoccupied with what was going on in India. They were preoccupied with what they saw as the Russian threat to the Ottoman Empire, and so this kind of took up most of their time, and they pretty much just ignored the rise of Germany, which is going to lead, of course, to problems down the line in World War One. But there were also conservative powers, namely Russia and Austria-Hungary. And these were societies that failed to adapt their politics to the modernization that was going on in the Industrial Revolution. So we see that forces of nationalism weaken Russia and Austria-Hungary. And if you look at this map, you can see why. In Austria-Hungary itself, you have many different ethnic groups here, about 10 different ethnic groups shown, but there are still more. This is going to be a problem for Austria because ultimately they alienate kind of Slavic-speaking minorities when they combine with Hungary and rename themselves the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This also offends Russia, who kind of sees Austria-Hungary's expansion as kind of challenging their own. In Russia, we see a lot of ethnic diversity as well, and that contributes to instability there. The idea of kind of Russification teaching or the process of assimilation in Russia for non-Russian speakers, it's going to be fairly divisive in Russia. attempts to um, impose the Russian language on this population really is not completely successful. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II emancipated the peasants from serfdom, but he does so in such a way that he only really turns them into communal farmers. They have very few skills and very little capital. Following him, Tsars Alexander III, Nicholas II opposed all forms of social change, really, in Russia. Russian industrialization is carried out mainly by the state, so the middle class remained small and weak, while landowning aristocracy dominated the courts and administration. And as we'll see later, the defeats of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War and the Revolution in 1905 really demonstrate the weakening of Russia. Tsar Nicholas II instituted a constitution and a parliament, but he soon basically just reverted to the system of despotism of the czars of Russia. So that's going to eventually spell disaster for Russia. Our next section is looking at Japan and the Eastern response, especially in Japan and China, to the imperialism and industrialism of the West. If you get done with today's assignment, you will. There's a crash course video for you to watch, which is really good and really does a good job of talking about Eastern responses to Western imperialism. But let's get started. And the main idea here is to understand that China and Japan had very different reactions to Western imperialism and the spread of Western influence. China resisted this influence and becomes much weaker, whereas Japan decides to transform itself and use it as a model to make itself major industrial and military power. Part of this can be seen maybe in the fact that China had a history of being very closed off and self-supporting, whereas Japan had adopted Chinese and Korean uh, customs and government styles and the like. So Japan was pretty used to adopting things from other cultures, even as they had periods of isolation. Anyways, in China, we see a self-strengthening movement which tried to bring about reforms. But the Empress Sushi, who you see here, and other officials opposed railways or other technologies that they thought would bring Western influence to the interior of China. They also slowed down foreign intrusion, but in doing so, they really denied themselves the best means of defense against foreign pressure. So in China, what we see here is even though the West had won influence in China, they're going to continue to try to keep them out. The self-strengthening movement tries to take some aspects of Western culture, especially in strengthening the administration and the military, but they really want to do so with their own people. They have a few outsiders who come in for advice, but for the most part, the upper class really just is focusing on strengthening the military so they can keep the Westerners out. Of course, this is going to be pretty much unsuccessful. In Japan, though, we see a different story. Up to 1867, we see Japan ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, and local lords have significant autonomy. This system really makes it hard, of course, for Japan to coordinate responses to outside threats. So in 1853, when the American Commodore Matthew Perry arrives in Japan with a fleet of huge steam-powered warships, the United States could demand that Japan open their ports to trade with American ships, and eventually that happens. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the shogunate, though, when he capitulates with the Americans and Europeans, and so it leads to a civil war and an overthrow of the shogunate in 1868. And this is the dawn of the Meiji Restoration. In response to kind of this Western intrusion, we see the shogunate overthrown and local Japanese or provincial lords launching this idea of a restoration, which quickly is going to actually modernize Japan. So the new rulers were called the Meiji oligarchs, and they were willing to change their institutions and their society in order to help transform their country into a world-class uh, industrial and military power. They saw adopting Western culture and the industrialism of the West as a way to avoid just simply an imperial power coming in and dominating. So they do learn this industrial and military power. They learn science and engineering. And they have new technology, and they take clothing styles from the West, and they even adopt Western um, uh, pastimes, etc. But the government is also a big player in encouraging industrialization. That's key to understand. Whereas China's government opposed Western ideas, the Japanese government eventually encouraged it. They fund industrial development with tax revenue, usually coming from the rural sector, and then also selling state-owned enterprises to private entrepreneurs. Industrialization in Japan is basically accompanied by the development of an authoritarian constitutional monarchy and a foreign policy that is imperialistic, that defined a sphere of influence for Japan, and that included areas of Korea, Manchuria, and parts of China. In 1894, Japan defeats China in a war, and this basically causes another reform effort in China, which kind of fails. It's called the 100 Days Reform, and it really set the stage in defeating China for a competition between Japan and Russia over control of Manchuria, which is this region in northeast China that bordered Russia. Japanese power, though, is going to be shown and further demonstrated as Japan defeats Russia in 1905 in the Russo-Japanese War. And in 1910, Japan would annex Korea. So what we see is Japan responding to this Western imperialism or this Western show of power by saying, all right, let's see what we can take in. Let's adopt Western culture. Let's build up our own industry. And in that way, we can resist being just in another imperial colony of the United States or Great Britain or whoever else, which is very different than China, who becomes kind of very much closed off. And that results in the European powers using their stronger militaries to come into China and have the same amount of influence that they probably would have otherwise. All right, that's it, guys. Have a good rest of the day. You have a reading on the industrialization and the changes in Japan, and then a quick activity related to that. Have a good day. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you Monday.